So welcome to my video on Roemer's revision of socialism, and in a short while I will explain why I want to go through this idea of Roemer, because it brings in very nicely all of what we have discussed throughout the whole of the. So I want to talk about briefly, as I just mentioned, about why we are discussing Roemer's model. Well, partly you want to discuss Roemer's model to explore this idea of market socialism. He is probably the most known scholar for articulating what market socialism would look like. And as we will see, Roemer's idea of socialism and his revision of socialism wants us to move away from this idea about the relationship between capital and labor and focus on distributive injustice. And I think Roemer's revision helps us illustrate why Marxists and socialists are fundamentally concerned about the relationship between capital and labor, which, as we have seen, is a recurring theme throughout our discussion, right? Whether it's in Piketty or whether it's in this talk about pre-distribution. And if you're interested in reading the specifics, although I think in this video I go through quite carefully the Roemer model, so you don't really need to read it to get a sense of what he's talking about. But if you want to, supplementary readings are on Luminous, and one of the supplementary readings where he actually details how market socialism would work and what he calls the Kantian Walrasian equilibrium is very technical. But if you have an interest in it, you can go ahead and look at it. So, in the previous session, we talked about the fundamental relationship in capitalism according to the sort of mainstream or sort of very popular understanding of socialism, which is this division or the relationship between capital and labor. And we discussed why this division is problematic. And then this idea is something that the typical Marxist answer is that we are centrally concerned with the control that capital owners have over workers. So one question you might ask is, well, why is control so important? And we'll discuss this in class. But now let's look at what Roemer thinks about this typical Marxist answer. So Roemer wants to argue that we should rethink about this idea about exploitation, right? Where he thinks that exploitation should not be thought of in terms of control. Rather, he wants to argue exploitation is unjust only if it reflects distributive injustice. So the implication is that therefore capitalism is only exploitative if it is conducted through other kinds of injustice like robbery, enclosure, and theft. And implication 2 is that he wants to argue that market socialism is not only consistent, but more controversially, it is actually more in the spirit of Marx's thinking. So let's see how we will do that. So in this video, what we're going to do is we will examine Roemer's argument for why the typical Marxist view of exploitation is problematic, and then we will look at what he thinks market socialism would look like in our class. Okay, so Roemer's strategy is something like that. Let's start off with a simple model of the economy, and then we're going to show that exploitation, understood typically under the Marxian thinking, will not occur under both collective ownership, which is the typical socialist thinking, right, where there is collective ownership of the means of production or capital and a certain configuration of the capitalist economy. What this means is that under both collective ownership and a capitalist economy, we don't get exploitation. So then the thought must be that we only get exploitation under other kinds of conditions. So let's take a look at what that means. So let's start off with the basic model. here we have a single production and consumption good. So for example, eggs, right? Eggs are in this very basic economy, people only produce and only consume eggs. That's all. That's what it means by a single production and consumption good, right? It's just only one good that's being produced and only one good that's being consumed. And in this economy, there are only two sectors with different technologies. So for example, if we're talking about eggs, there's commercial farming using automation, and then there's villages that are rearing kampongs, right, of a kind, right, rearing chickens to hatch eggs. Basic model. So now let's take a look at the first economy. Now, when we talk about economy, instead of eggs, right, the example that Roemer gives is corn. So we have 1,000 peasants in this economy, and they all collectively own the corn. There's collective ownership of the capital, which is corn, or corn seed, more specifically, right? So using this, they can produce 500 C or 500 units of corn. Okay, so some assumptions about the peasants. They only want to make enough so that they can survive. This is what we mean by subsistence preference forever, in perpetuity. They just want to make enough to survive and have enough food in their bellies to survive. And at the same time, they want to maximize leisure, weekly leisure. And for them, subsistence means 1 corn per week. So, assumptions about the economy, right? First of all, there's factory farming for the production of corn. And then the second technology is forest, where you can go and get corn. Okay, so for factory farming, if you put 1 bushel of corn and you tend it with 1 day of labor, at the end of the week you'll get 2 bushels of corn. So 1 C plus 1 day of labor, then you'll get 2 bushels of corn. Then in the forest, you have to plant and so on and so forth, and you don't have technology, right? So you have to work more, right? So 3 days of labor produces 1 bushel of corn in the forest. And the forest doesn't require any kind of capital. So, assumption. Society would prefer to produce the 1,000 corn without reducing the capital stock of 500 corn, right? So we already said 1 corn per week, right? Don't know why these people need so little food, just assume that's the case, right? 1,000 peasants, 1 times 1,000, 1,000 corn. 500 capital stock of corn. But you don't want to reduce the capital stock, you want to keep on replenishing it, right? So you prefer to produce this 1,000 corn without depleting your capital stock. Second assumption, all members of the society, they are okay with working on the farm or the forest. They only care about corn and they only care about leisure time. So now let's suppose that we have common ownership, as we discussed, right? Then there will be a Pareto and efficient and egalitarian equilibrium according to Roemer, which is something like that. So 250 peasants will work for 2 days on the factory farm. So for 1 day, the peasants working will produce 500 bushels at the end of the week, correct? Right? That's what we discussed earlier. And for 2 days, they will put 250 peasants working will produce 1,000 bushels, right? Then they have to take this 500 to replenish the capital stock, and the net gain is 500 corn, right? Then for the other peasants, they will work 2 days in the forest, right? And then eventually, so that means they work 2 days and then you divide it by 3, eventually they get 500 bushels, right? Correct. So you get 500 bushels from the factory, and you get 500 bushels from the forest, and so you get your 1000, and you manage to replenish your capital stock. So subsistence met. And in total, all the peasants, because remember, they are okay working either on the farm or the forest, they don't care. So in total, every peasant works the same number of days, 2 days. Total is 2000 days, right? This is what Marx, according to Roemer, this is what Marx called the socially necessary labor time. Well, not just according to Roemer, this is what Marx said also. Right? So given the preferences of the members, 2000 days of labor is the unique, egalitarian, efficient, and sustainable solution to the peasants' preferences, right? Because the peasants, they don't care whether they work at the factory, farm, or the forest. Why? Don't ask me. This is just an assumption, right? And then and what they want most is to survive and to maximize leisure time, right? In this model, they only work 2 days a week, and then 5 days of the week they can go and do whatever they want, right? So that's kind of like egalitarian and optimal solution. Now compare this with a capitalist economy where there's 10 members of the society, they own 500 bushels of capital stock, meaning that each capitalist owns 50 bushels, right? Simple, right? So imagine now the society, there's only 10 people who have capital, then the rest of the 990, they only have their labor power, they have to work for the people, right? Basically, that's the idea. No, work for the capitalists, not the people. Okay, so assumption about the capitalists. They wish to maximize leisure time subject to consuming 1 bushel per week, right? The same consumption rate, right, as the peasants previously in the collective ownership economy. And of course, they want to replace their capital stock, right? If the capitalist can accumulate more capital stock, that's good, right? But as long as no more labor is required of her. That means, in other words, the capitalist wants leisure time over getting more capital. So suppose now, in this economy, there's a labor market where capitalists can hire laborers to work at the factory, right? Because capitalists, they own the factors of production and blah blah blah, and so they hire you to work in the factory. And again, the same thing, right? People are indifferent between working at the factory and in the forest. So also suppose that the forest remains a possible source of corn, right? And it's the same thing that happens. 3 days of labor gives you 1 bushel of corn. So what is the equilibrium wage, or W, right? For those of you who know your basic economics, I think you should be able to tell me the answer, and the answer is 1/3, right? Because very simple, right? If the wage is more than 1/3, right, given that they only want to replace capital stock, then you eat into their profits. But if the wage is less than 1/3, then the laborers won't work at the forest, right? Correct? So wage is gonna be naturally 1/3 bushel. So remember, capitalist owns 50, right? So then they're gonna give up 50 wages, right? 50 divided by 3, right? And then they're gonna use 50 bushels to replace the capital stock, and then the profit is 50 minus 3 minus 50 divided by 3 equals 33.3333, right? If we look at the economy at large, right, capitalists will hire about 500 divided by 3, roughly 167 peasants for 3 days a week, right? So then they can get 1 unit of corn to survive. The remaining peasants will work in the forest for 3 days, and then they will get 1 unit of corn. That's enough to survive, right? The capitalists will have will take 1,000 units of corn. They will spend 500 for capital stock, and then they will say 500 divided by 3 is the wages. The remaining profit is around 333 as the profit, right? Now, under capitalism, total labor time increased, right? Is now 2970. Corn consumption of the peasants is exactly the same with egalitarian economy and with common ownership. So according to Roemer, right? I mean, not according to Roemer, Marx did say this, right? The extra 970 days that the people have to work is called surplus labor. And according to Roemer, this part is according to Roemer, right? He argues that this existence of surplus labor is exploitation. So Roemer wants to say that here we have from when we compare capitalism to collective ownership, we see that there are three conditions needed for exploitation to occur. And the three are, first, unequal ownership of the capital stock, which we saw in capitalism, right, versus collective ownership, right? But Roemer wants to say that it's not enough just that you have unequal ownership, right? You also must have a labor market, and you must also have scarcity of capital relative to the labor available for employment. So let's look at why he thinks this is the case. So first of all, right, he wants to show that existence of labor market alone doesn't generate exploitation. Right? So suppose that we have a common ownership economy and allocate the 500 bushels to all individuals, right? Then each peasant will get half bushel. It shows us that the labor market is not required for exploitation to occur by comparing two scenarios. So suppose now there is a collective ownership economy, and in scenario A, each peasant would work up their capital stock with half of a day labor in the factory, and then they will earn a surplus of half bushel. Then they will spend 1.5 days in the forest and getting the other half to survive, right? So they replenish capital stock in the factory, then they still get a surplus of half, and then they have to get another half to survive. Then they work in the factory then they survive. So in total, 1.5 plus half, 2 days work. Now compare this with scenario B, where there is going to be a labor market. So same thing as scenario A, where we have collective ownership of half bushel per peasant. Equilibrium wage is 1/3, doesn't change for reasons that we already know, because the working and the alternative of the forest, blah blah blah. So we can get a situation where 250 peasants work in the factory farm for half a day. They replenish their capital stock, then replenish the capital stock of 3 other peasants. So total is 1.5 days of labor, earning half a bushel. So in other words, they will get 1 bushel for 2 days work. Then the other peasants, which are the capitalists, they will work in the forest for 2 days. They will collect 2/3 bushels, and then they'll earn 1/3 bushel from their profit, which they will then put back in the farm and so on. Here, both the capitalists and the laborers work 2 days. So there's no exploitation, even though there is a labor market. So in both scenario A and scenario B, the same result, 2 days of labor. There's no exploitation in the sense of surplus labor, right, which is where you have the same consumption with more hours work. No, right? It's the same consumption, same hours work, even though there's a labor market, right? And why is that the case? Because there's no unequal ownership of capital stock. So Roemer also has some other arguments for why, even though you might need scarcity of capital, things like that. But let's just leave that aside, right? The important point here is that the existence of labor market alone, right, according to Roemer, doesn't lead to exploitation. So Roemer then asks, right, why are we so concerned about exploitation in this particular sense? Which is the sense that I'm going to read out from what he writes now. Why should exploitation so define that the masses of peasants work longer than they would if the capital stock were collectively owned for the same consumption be an instance of injustice? Right? Why is it that the fact that people work longer than if the capital stock were collectively owned be a problem? And it seems that the answer must be that, given what we have discussed, right, it is the way that capital has been accumulated, right? So if capital is accumulated properly, right, in a sort of proper way, then the mere fact that there is surplus labor shouldn't be a problem. That's the kind of thought that Roemer has. Right? Basically, the processes are these, right? The way that capital is accumulated, if it is not accumulated by hard work or entrepreneurial innovation, but by robbery or deception or enclosure or theft, right, then that is what makes it wrong. Right? So Roemer argues that the mere existence of owners of capital and the mere existence of a labor market, right, therefore is not inherently problematic, right? Because definitely, contra to what he thinks Marx says, is that there are many instances of capital accumulation that take place through hard work or inventiveness. And it is not obvious, according to Roemer, why the hiring of workers to labor on dishonestly accumulated capital and their consequent exploitation, right, in inverted commas now, I guess you can say, should be considered an instance of injustice. Right? The mere existence of exploitation and profits, right, according to him, is not problematic. Right? Why is that problematic? Right? And Roemer also argues that it is noteworthy that Marx spent a lot of time actually arguing that actual capitalism often doesn't come through ingenuity or hard work, right, but through other unjust means. So, if this is right, exploitation defined as someone working longer than they would have if the capital stock were collectively owned for the same consumption, right? So the idea would be that if you consume 1 corn per week under capitalism and also consume 1 corn per week under collective ownership, but you have to work longer hours under capitalism, that's exploitation, that it can only be unjust if and only if it arises from distributive injustice, like robbery or some kind of other unjust action. If capitalism is to be unjust, then it must come through this kind of injustice, right? And more controversially, Roemer thinks that Marx also had this view about exploitation and capitalism. So, if the claims are correct, right, what Roemer wants to say is that the ethics of socialism should be reformulated. Right? So we shouldn't be so concerned, in other words, with the relationship between capital and labor, according to Roemer. Rather, what we should be concerned with is the elimination of distributive injustice, right? We should be concerned about unequal ownership of capital and the relative scarcity of capital to labor, right? So that means it's more about having a more equal distribution of capital, and that should be enough, right, to sort of avoid the key normative concern we have, right? And another further implication, of course, as he already said, right, is that the mere existence of a market, both in terms of having a division between capitalists and laborers, and the labor market, obviously, because if you have a division between capital and labor, typically you should have a labor market. Otherwise, how is capital going to be effective? Well, of course, one answer is automation, right? But assuming that labor, you always need some labor to produce some other goods or services, right? Then whenever you have a division between capital and labor, you tend to have a labor market, right? That's kind of like the basic. Those things tend to go hand in hand. And so what Roemer wants to say, right, by going this route, right, what he really wants to open up the space is that capital and markets are consistent with socialist ethics, right? And in fact, he probably wants to go a further step, right, to argue that this probably is the most best form of socialism, right, in terms of actually being consistent and actually identifying clearly what is wrong with capitalism, right? What is wrong with capitalism is not the fact that there are some people who have own capital and some people who cannot, right? But more the fact that it's unequally distributed, capital is scarce, things like that. So, some lingering questions, right? What would this retooled version of socialism look like? And is Roemer right that the socialists should abandon the claim that socialism is concerned with the exploitation of elimination of exploitation? Let's find out in class. Thank you.